Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about maybe one of the weirdest books I've ever read, to be honest. And that book is Our Wives Under the Sea. Guys, I don't even know where to start with this book. Okay, it is a horror. It's not really, but it's classified as a horror. And it's pretty short. It's like 220 pages. I listened to it on an audiobook, which so it's like a 6 hour 20-minute audiobook, something like that. And it is following a woman. It's following two different perspectives. One is just significantly shorter than the other. At least that's how it felt when I read it. I don't actually know. But it's following a woman, Miri, and which I swear to God, I thought her name was Mary for most of the book, because it's read by like a British narrator, I guess. Yeah, it's read by a British narrator, and Miri was coming out as Mary, and I was like, okay, Mary. And then at the very end, I was looking at the chapters, and like it even says like Miri, and I'm like, what? I had her name wrong the whole story. I doubt that would have changed my opinion on it, but we're following Miri, and her wife has just come back from being missing at sea for 6 months, and something is very wrong, and she's acting very strangely, and Miri's trying to figure out what is kind of happening while also dealing with her own trauma and loss of her wife. On the other side, we're following Leah, and we're doing flashbacks of kind of through her like notes of what was going on in the submarine when it went missing. So it has a really good setup as a premise. The problem with this book is it was beyond bizarre. It was so weird. And even if it wasn't weird, I still just didn't like the writing style, didn't like the characters, didn't pretty much like anything about this. Mostly because their writing style. Let's start there. First of all, I gave this book a 2. It was almost like a -5. The first 4 hours I listened to this book, I was like, why am I doing this? Oh, I'm doing this because Amazon won't let me return the audiobook, so I'm just gonna finish it. I'm at work, we're just gonna finish it. So that's why I didn't DNF it. That's why I finished it, which I'm kind of happy I did, because the best part, in my opinion, was the end. So we'll get to that in the spoilers, because we will be talking about spoilers a little bit. It's very strange. It's very, very strange. So in reality, this book is an exploration of grief. This is not, in my opinion, a horror. I feel like the only reason it's horror is because they threw in some body horror towards the end. Like, there is some weird shape-shifting happening with our main character, Leah, and you don't really know exactly what's going on. It's kind of abstract. You start getting it about 3 hours in, you're like, oh, that's what's happening. And then I had a little chuckle, and I was like, okay. I did not realize that this was literally just going to be a story about grief. This is not the kind of book that I enjoy. I highly recommend it to people who do enjoy that kind of story. I noticed the reason that I picked this up is because a ton of my favorite booktubers, like Books with Lala, Gabby Reads, I think there's a couple more, loved this book. They thought it was so good, and I was like, oh, like, let me check it out. Like, it's not that long. It was in the Goodreads Choice Awards for horror. This could be really, really good. Love the cover. I think it's really cool. No. I should have read the reviews, because they even say it's about grief. So for me, this is not horror. For me, this is literary fiction, and just, it's a story about grief. It's a story about grief, and I would definitely not read this if you are just expecting a horror story. To me, the horrifying aspects of it, again, like I said, there is some body horror in it, not like a ton compared to regular horror, and it's mostly the horror relates to loss. So if you find loss horrifying, it's gonna be a horror to you. I find it horrifying, but I still don't. I mean, I feel like Colleen Hoover would be considered a horror in that case, if we want to go there. So that's my issue, is where do you draw the line of, is this horror or a literary fiction? Because I feel like this is very similar to some other books I've read in literary fiction, minus the body horror. I feel like the body horror is just thrown in there to put it in the horror category. But the things that I really just didn't vibe with this book is really it's the writing style. I did not like how the story was told, because you would be getting on a really good train of thought and you're like, oh, okay, I'm getting it, I'm starting to feel something. And then you'd swerve and you're like, what? Where did that, like, where are we? What is happening? So we'd be in the middle of like Miri talking about taking care of Leah and struggling with Leah and trying to call the center where she came from and trying to get answers from them. And then it would swerve to her mother getting sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker like a year or two ago. And you're like, wait a minute. Like, I get you're drawing correlations, but how does you not being able to get a hold of the center then all of a sudden jump us to a story about your mother and issues you had with her and her dying? And I was just like, oh, we're jumping around. So it would throw you out of the story into something completely different. And I'm just like, so like there were definitely moments where I'd be like, oh, this is so good. And then I would just lose it. I would lose it because I'd be thrown out. And then it was the same thing with Leah's side of the story. Leah's side of the story started really interesting because they're talking about the submarine going down and what they're gonna do, and you meet her like crewmates and stuff going on. And then all of a sudden it would jump to issues with her father. And then she would go on long tangents about sea creatures. And you're like, stop doing that. Stop doing that. I did not like that. I did not like it. I feel like it was to diffuse tension, but I wanted that tension. I wanted to like feel how upset Miri was while Leah slowly declined. I wanted to feel Leah's terror as the submarine was going down. But instead, we're just getting these tangents where you just are taken out. So that I had a major problem with that, because I feel like this could have been 4 or 5 stars if those tangents weren't thrown in. If we stayed more along a direct path, or even like just the flashbacks made sense. They weren't like mid-paragraph is what it seemed like. You would just switch to something else. And that's why it ended up with a 2, because the ending started staying on track more. The ending, when they were finally figuring out what was going on in the submarine, and when Miri kind of started catching on to what was going on and kind of starting to accept it, because Miri's basically going through the stages of grief throughout the book, and when you finally get to her like acceptance phase, that's when the book really started to hit, because she stopped going on tangents. I know it makes sense, like you're trying to avoid grief, so you think about other things. However, I didn't enjoy the way that it felt like a brain thinking. So if you enjoy that kind of abstract way of writing, I feel like you'll really, really like this. I did not like reading the way a brain thinks. I guess is the best way to think about it. I wanted more of a linear storyline, because that's how I feel impacted by these kinds of stories. I don't care about the random octopus you took care of 6 months ago. I don't need a whole chapter on that. So it's just like, oh, and I felt like there was a lot of stuff in here you just didn't need. Like her being nasty to one of her friends who was just trying to be helpful. I feel like a little bit can be thrown in there, but there was a lot of that in there, and I was just like, it didn't feel like it made any impact at the end of the story, if that makes sense. And then the ending was beautiful. I will say that. This book, I'll probably remember this book for a long time, because it is really weird. It is really weird. But the ending was very beautiful, and so that's why I couldn't give it a 1 or no stars, because even though I trudged and laughed and suffered through the first 4 hours, the last 2 hours were wonderful. So it makes it such a hard book to rate, because if I were to rate just the last 2 hours, it would be like 4. If I rate the first 4 hours, it's a -20. So that's why I'm having such a difficult time with this book. And it was just weird. It was also just really weird. But yeah, I would say if you are looking for a horror book, don't read this. Don't read this. If you are looking for an exploration of grief, an exploration of a relationship, an exploration of mental illness, deterioration, falling apart, and the ramifications of that to people around you, I think this is a good book to read. Problem is, I never want to read a book like that. So for me, this was not what I was looking for. I wanted some of that with more horror aspects. Yeah. Anyway, let's talk about spoilers really fast. This is going to be a super quick review because it's a very short book. There's not a lot to talk about. Anyway, spoilers. Basically, Leah is turning into a fish. Pretty sure a jellyfish. Which is what made me cackle. I was in the middle of work and I finally figured it out. And one of my coworkers walks over and she's like, what are you reading? Or what are you listening to? I was like, oh, I'm listening to an audiobook called Our Wives Under the Sea. And are you going to read it? She's like, no, I don't really read that much. And I was like, yeah, our main character's turning into a fish. And she's like, oh, okay. And that's how I felt about it. Until the end, when I really finally felt a connection to the characters. So at the end, Miri finally kind of gets on track and she realizes Leah's not going to get better. Leah's not going to get better. She kind of stops trying to force her to get better because that's the one thing this book does really well. And it doesn't shy away from a spouse dealing with their spouse's mental breakdown because it's hard. It's hard. Like I went through probably a week where I couldn't leave bed because I was in so much physical pain. Like mine was a physical disorder. It still is. But I'm sure my husband thought at one point, like, just get up, stop crying, just get up. I'm sure he thought about it, and I wouldn't blame him. Everyone feels that way. Like, when you're helpless, you can't do anything, and you feel like the other person just needs to get up and suck it up, and that's not how life works. So I really appreciated the fact that the author didn't shy away from discussing such difficulties like that. Like, Miri was frustrated. She just wanted her wife back, and I get that, because that's how pretty much everyone feels when their spouse or partner or family member starts going through something, a physical disorder or a mental disorder. Because it's really hard. You want your life to be back to normal. You don't want to be experiencing this grief attached to them. So I really liked that she didn't pull any punches with that, which made Miri seem like an asshole. But in reality, she's just real. She was a real character. So that also kind of bumped it up. So maybe 2.5. But the more I'm talking about it, the more I'm like, okay, there was a lot of depth in this. I just needed time to like process it. But I still couldn't get over the fact she was turning into a fish. So that's where my biggest holdup was. But anyway, the part that really turned me in this book was when, yeah, like I said, Miri finally kind of levels off, kind of just caters to Leah, brings her water that has salt in it, trying to make her feel as comfortable as possible. And she's not trying to force her to get up, move, get up, do things. She's just kind of accepted it. She's reached that point of her depressive phase where she has accepted this loss. And she finally realizes like what Leah needs. And she ends up releasing her into the ocean. And it is so sad. It is so sad. And then, of course, we end the book with Leah's point of view, which was... it was so sad. It was so sad. Leah finally gets to see Miri. She like gets out of the submarine and she's excited to see Miri, and the last thing in the book is her saying Miri's name. So it's just, oh, that killed me. Killed me because because obviously her flashbacks are in the past, so she's excited to see her and she doesn't realize the journey she's about to go on. So it's definitely like kind of an open-ended ending. Like you don't know exactly if like it really happened, almost like magical realism, like the stuff is actually happening, or if it is just straight up a metaphor for what is happening in their life and possibly depression leading to suicide maybe, and Miri's acceptance of it, or if she even came back at all. Like who knows if she even came back, and Miri's just kind of dealing with her own ghosts at this point. So I don't know, there's a lot of interpretation I feel like you can take in this book. If you want to just call it a straight up horror and it's really happening, you can do that. If you want to call it a exploration on grief and that this stuff isn't really happening, that also works. It can be taken that way. So there's a lot of different ways this book can be taken, and that's why I really, really enjoyed the ending, because I felt like we finally like focused on the real problems happening and we're able to deal with them. And I was a little torn up at the end. So I think this book had a lot of potential. For me, it was just ruined by that writing style of just ripping you out of the story. So I could not connect for the first 4 hours, and then it was like whoosh, suck you into the story. So I think I would definitely try this author again. I don't know. I'm very torn because of the writing style, but we'll see. This is a debut book, so maybe she'll like refine it a little bit and less jumpiness, more making sense. Because like if you start in the next chapter and she's talking about her mom, different. Just don't rip me out of a very, very important scene that we're on to jump to something that ends up not feeling that important in the long run. So anyway, that is my book review for Our Wives Under the Sea. Weird one. Very weird one. Wasn't expecting to start the year off with a very strange book, but I'm kind of glad I read it. I'm so weird about this book. By my January wrap up, I may have changed my mind. I may love this. I may lower it. I don't know. I don't know yet. This is going to be one that's going to like sit with me, and I'm going to have to decide where it sits at as I go on throughout time. Maybe by the end of the year it'll be a 5-star. I don't know. It's already gone up by 0.5 stars the more I talk about it, so I don't know. Anyway, make sure you subscribe for more book reviews, and I will see you guys in the next video.